Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Vancouver Overcast with Mike Klassen. On this episode of the podcast, we're going to discuss part one of 2021's biggest stories on local government in British Columbia, as decided by me and my guest. Whether it was taxes, election campaign announcements, natural disasters, police budgets, or climate change, BC's municipal councils were on the front lines of this year's most tumultuous events. Before I introduce our guests, I want to thank everyone who has subscribed, liked, shared, or emailed me comments on the podcast. It really feels great to be back posting regular episodes featuring compelling conversations with so many interesting people. If you're new to the show, I invite you to visit www.overcastyvr.ca to learn more about subscribing, sharing, and supporting Vancouver Overcast and Mike Klassen. When it comes to local government in BC, there are a few who understand it as well as my guest, Daniel Fontaine. Daniel is a longtime friend with a superlative background in politics and government. He is currently Deputy Minister and CEO of Métis Nation, British Columbia. Daniel has more than 15 years of senior management experience in public relations and government affairs, including serving as Chief of Staff to Mayor of Vancouver, Sam Sullivan, where he and I had the pleasure to work closely together. Daniel was Chief Public Affairs Officer for MyTax, an influential nonprofit organization that links industries and post-secondary institutions to advance relevant industry research. He then took on the post as CEO of BC Care Providers Association, where we once again had the opportunity to work together in support of BC seniors and the people that care for them. However, it's our work together as the co-founders of citycaucus.com, a groundbreaking civic politics website that garnered over 5 million page views during its 3.5-year run, that kind of brings us together on this important topic of local government. Daniel continues his active interest in local government politics as the founding board president of the New West Progressives elector organization. So I'm pleased to have Daniel here. Daniel Fontaine, thank you very much for coming on to episode 16 of the Vancouver Overcast podcast. We're going to do something that we haven't done for a couple of years. It was the end of 2019 that we talked about all of the sort of the top local government stories. A lot has passed with them, but we're just going to focus on 2021, and then maybe we'll, at the end, we'll round it out, talk a little bit about what we should be looking forward to in 2022. So, first of all, for the benefit of the listeners and the viewers, not a lot of people will remember citycaucus.com, which we ended up shutting down just about 10 years ago. For the uninitiated, maybe let people know what City Caucus was.
Well, Mike, just to keep it really simple, City Caucus was really one of two things. If you were a fan of the 2010 Olympics, you'll remember it for the Where to Be for Free guide, and it was one of the reasons why we had millions of hits on the site, and people got to use that Where to Be for Free guide over the course of the Olympics, and that's where a lot of people actually discovered citycaucus.com for the first time. But if you were a kind of a political junkie, somebody who followed municipal and Metro Vancouver politics, you got initiated with City Caucus a bit earlier, and that was back in 2008, I believe, when it was officially launched. And it was just really an opportunity. It was kind of citizen journalism. It was the use of freedom of information requests and folks that kind of you and I both knew kind of within the city circles who were providing us with information and tips on stories. And we had lots of breaking news, and you and I did a lot of stories on CTV Global, all the mainstream media, all driven through City Caucus, which pretty much almost every day had a story, one or two stories published every day on some issue that was burning in municipal government. And we all know that there's lots of topics to discuss, and we had no shortage over the time that we had City Caucus running.
And of course, today is a great big dump of snow hit Metro Vancouver. City Caucus really came out of the gate during Snowmageddon 2008. 2009, we were all over Global, CTV, CBC. I remember that was the first time that we started getting media calls because we had been online being critical of the city's snow response. Deja vu happening all over again. We've been seeing people online complaining about snow removal challenges in Vancouver. I don't know why that story keeps coming back, but guess it would have been fun to have City Caucus around again this time of the year to just at least talk about that one issue.
Well, it's good to know that la plus ça change, the more things stay the same. So we're still talking
Absolutely.
about snow removal. Yeah.
So I promised the listeners that we're going to be talking about what are some of the top local government stories of 2021. So we're going to start with January, and we're going to go. And so you and I have had a chance to go through literally dozens of stories that happened this year, and all over the province and in different municipalities.
Yeah, and Mike, that felt a little bit like the Academy Awards, where you're throwing away all these great movies, and you know that they're not going to make it in the list because there was a lot to go through. But yes, we did go through that list.
I know, but for the benefit of the listeners, we're going to try and whittle it down. And some of these stories might seem they may have some more kind of local focus, but the reason we chose them is we think that they had some larger implications for way cities are governed in British Columbia. So the very first story that we have for January, again, seems like a small local Vancouver only story, but it was the departure of Sadhu Johnston as city manager at the city of Vancouver. Daniel, what's your sort of, now you and I, of course, when we were doing City Caucus, we almost made Sadhu famous in anticipation and wrote a lot of stories about him, all of which were very fair. I used to run into him later, and he, even though I think he was alarmed at the fact that we gave him so much attention at the time, I don't think he was angry at what we said, because the fact is that the people who had worked with him previously generally thought he was a good guy, but he became really, I think, a part of a larger movement around the Vision Vancouver government. So any thoughts about his legacy and then what it meant for the city for him to leave?
Well, I think I'd first maybe just speak to the whole issue of how many city managers we've had over the last decade. And, you know, the city of Vancouver has traditionally prided itself on having a nonpartisan public service, one that, you know, a city manager doesn't come and go at the whim of a mayor or council, that we have that ability to carry forward. With the departure of Judy Rogers, when Vision Vancouver came in and replacing her with Penny Ballum, that began a process of really effectively politicizing the city manager's office. And we saw that when Sadhu took over from Penny, when Penny departed and received a fairly significant, I think, severance package, and then she moved on, and then Sadhu took over, who was the assistant deputy manager. And with his departure, it really is effectively the end of Vision Vancouver, because he was so linked to that political organization and was backstopped, and the mayor and Vision supported him for so many years. And with his departure now, perhaps, and I say that, you know, hoping that we've gone back to an era of just having nonpartisan public servants who are running the city, who are just doing a good job and aren't there for any particular partisan political purposes. But Sadhu was a nice enough fellow. I only, I think, met him once. I think you had an opportunity to meet him way more than I did. Nice enough fellow, but his departure, I think, sends a signal, hopefully, that we're going back to the day where public servants are there to serve the public and to make sure that the roads are working and the sewers are working properly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, there's a strong tradition of the nonpartisan public service, and CAOs or city managers across the province who really pride themselves on being professional public servants. I've had a chance to talk to many of them over the years, and I would like to signal kind of a vote of confidence in the person, the people in that office now. We got Paul Mokri, who is the city manager at the City of Vancouver, Karen Levitt, and now Armin Amrolia, who is now coming on as a brand new, formerly of BC Housing, as the co-deputy. So I think it's a very interesting group, and it shows a lot of promise. But again, they have to really work with council, and the whole question of where Vancouver Council going is a completely different subject. So I'm going to move on to February, and I actually have a couple of stories highlighted. One in your hometown of New Westminster. Maybe we'll start with that one. And it was the whole topic around defunding police became a very popular cause, a rallying cry for progressive voters in many cities. But a proposal was brought forward to the city of New Westminster, and maybe you can tell us what happened there and why you think it's an important story.
Yeah, so back in February, there was a move by a number of the councillors who are very much on the kind of the center left of the political spectrum, moved a motion to look at defunding the police. And if you recall back in and around that period, there was a lot of discussion around that, around cutting police budgets, transferring budgets from police over to other services. And I won't delve into the kind of the political merits or non-merits of all that, but that was all being discussed in and around then. So City Council in New Westminster did put forward that motion, and at the end of the day, it was defeated. So even though in my home community, all the city councillors are all part of the same political party, unlike Vancouver, there was that split there. So it worked out where at the end of the day, I think the elected officials who voted to not defund the police were listening to their constituents and hearing a lot of concerns around removing funding for the police at a period in a time where there is concern around issues of lawlessness and being able to access police services. So it'll be interesting to see if this happens and we're heading into the municipal election now in 2022, and whether or not this issue of defund the police gets picked up again as part of political platforms, and we'll talk about that later with different municipal parties coming out, whether that's going to be something to move forward to, or if it just gets dropped, because it literally did not go over well in New West and it was defeated. And if it can't get past here, I doubt it's going to have a lot of resonance in other communities outside of New West.
The issue of the cost of policing and the issue of policing and whether to defund the police or restructure the police forces has been a huge story right across in Surrey, in Vancouver. There was a very contentious discussion around the police budget there. We even later on had Mayor Kennedy decided to resign as spokesperson for the police board, even though he was the chair of the police board. So and we're also seeing an interesting movement. There's an author by the name of Michael Schellenberger who's written a book that has piqued my interest. It's called San Francisco, and how progressives have ruined American cities. Very provocative sort of subtitle to that book, but it's really about how, and he's a very kind of liberal, kind of center left writer, but he's taken a look at how cities around the world, the models of law enforcement and dealing with some of the open use of drugs and things like that have to be dealt with in a different fashion, and because they are really overtaking resources and really bringing down cities like many municipalities.
Yeah, and I think that the fundamental argument of those who are moving for the defund is really around, are the resources being put into the right place? So we all know from intensive amounts of research that have been done over the last number of years that a greater part and a portion of the work that are being done by our police are really mental health. It's mental health workers. And so, is the response to defund the police, or is the response to provide more resources and supports for people with mental health? And I've seen some interesting models where you're seeing mental health workers actually being hired to work alongside the police, so that they're actually the police can do their policing and the mental health workers can help people on their mental health side. And perhaps there's that middle ground there versus just defunding or adding more funding into the police, but maybe looking at increasing those supports for people that are living with mental health issues and that are living on the streets primarily, the ones that the police are dealing with, and how do we deal with that? And I think there are some solutions there.
So we're still in February, but I also wanted to bring up a story that kind of jumped out, and we talked about it, and it was just a very contentious fight over a 6-story building being approved in Kitsilano in Vancouver. Now, Vancouver, the stories are legend of density politics, so-called spot rezonings are always they get people very fired up on all sides. But at the same time, the argument is made over and over again. We don't have land. We have people. We have demand for housing. So Daniel, I know, again, we talked about plus ça change a little bit earlier on. This is a story that continues, but Vancouver seems to be almost the model of where the kind of so-called NIMBY vote clashes with the YIMBY vote, who want to see more density. Any sort of reflections on what you're seeing, particularly in Vancouver, but in other cities around density?
Well, going back in the time machine, when I worked for Mayor Sullivan, the issue of density, he was the one politician I know that was actually prepared to use the D word. He pushed very much and connecting density with the environment and connecting density with our issues of affordability and making sure that housing was affordable. And it's hard to believe that we're so many years since 2008 when those discussions were happening at Vancouver City Hall, and yet today still, Mike, those issues are still there. I will say, though, that the narrative and the discourse around this topic is very different than it was back in 2008. You now have a lot of people, particularly younger generations, who are saying density is going to be the key for me to be able to buy a home in Vancouver or to get a place in Metro Vancouver that's more affordable. They're more vocal and they're more organized than they were in 2008. Back in that era, it was pretty much all the NIMBYs that were coming out, and nobody was coming to council promoting a 6-story rental accommodation. Absolutely not. But we have come to learn, I think, and especially with the issues of climate change and how impactful climate change is, that when we rip out our farmland and we rip out land that was used for producing commercial crops, etc., and we convert that into housing in the places like the Fraser Valley, when we could be putting people closer to the downtown core and allowing them to live closer to where they work, we know that has positive impacts for climate change. So I don't know, Mike. I think we're moving into a whole new era where I'm hoping that the Yes in My Backyard folks do actually speak out even a little bit louder, and that the media cover them and provide a little bit more balance. But we'll see. Time will tell. It's that movement is just emerging and somewhat linking itself to the climate change, which I think is not a bad thing.
So, staying with an old topic of much debate in Vancouver, we're going to talk about bike lanes. Now, you and I have a lot of background and history with this issue. I think I concede the fact that active transportation and having good bike lane infrastructure is absolutely critical to cities. We're seeing sort of more municipalities modernizing their transportation infrastructure to improve both pedestrian and cycling and other mobility devices. But in Vancouver, and it was really kind of a story that came out of the pandemic, the park board decided to narrow down the route around Stanley Park. And it became just a huge rift between, many people in the media that were attacking it. With some people on the political side, particularly Commissioners John Cooper and Tricia Barker, were also raising concerns. Tricia emphasizing the lack of accessibility for the park for elderly people, for example, who need those vehicles. And then the other side of the equation, people who are very active and passionate about bikes. Why is it that Vancouver, in your view, having lived there, having worked there, keeps coming around to this debate? I'm hearing it less and less, but this one was a hot one, and that's why it jumps out as one of our stories of 2021.
Well, I think you have to go back, Mike, to the original kind of what triggered this whole debate and what really got this going. And it really came down to, it was a Vision Vancouver platform. It was Vision Vancouver that really pushed and politicized and made bike lanes a partisan issue. I mean, prior to that, them getting elected, I mean, who talked about bike lanes as a partisan political issue? But for their decade in power, that was one of the things you talked about Vision Vancouver, and the first thing that would pop into your mind is bike lanes. We should not have things like bike lanes being controversial issues. These are things that we should just be integrating and building into our cities. We all know that, using the bicycle or walking as a pedestrian is way better for the environment than, taking your Hummer or your Cadillac and driving around town. We get that. Everyone, I think, understands that. But in Vancouver, there was a decade there where the city was effectively told to prioritize bike lanes, make sure that they were clean first. And I think you and I were both arguing that the number one mode of transportation in Vancouver by far, I think it's by a country mile, is foot traffic. It's pedestrians. they make up the vast majority of the trips in the city of Vancouver. And I think that's why it still gets a lot of attention, because it really riles people up when they're looking and they see a bike lane that's been cleared of snow, and yet the pedestrian lane, which has got 10 times more usage, is full of ice and not cleared. And I think that that's still a carryover from the previous regime, which I'm hoping that the city of Vancouver and the public servants are hearing loud and clear, that they have to prioritize pedestrians at least on the same level that they do with cyclists.
Absolutely. Well, it certainly has been a lot of rancor raised about this during our most recent snow events. But wedge politics, who knew that bikes would be the root of a huge political divide here in the city of Vancouver? Now, again, I know we did curate a list, and I promise the listeners that we're going to have stories from other parts of British Columbia. But we're moving on to April now. And I want to talk about the fact that we had some major announcements around people wanting to run for mayor. The implication being that the election is not until October 2022. So this would probably be the first time that we've ever seen the launch of an 18-month local government campaign. You know that they are draining financially, draining emotionally, physically to run a campaign, even for 3 or 4 months, but to do it for 18 months is extraordinary. So what really kind of prompted this is that the MPA, Vancouver's MPA party that's been around since the 1930s, announced that they had selected through a vote of their board to appoint John Coupar, the commissioner from the park board, who had run as a candidate in 2018, as their mayoralty choice. This caused a rift that had been sort of simmering for a while. It led to three of the MPA council slate to leave. It also had implications later on for school trustees on the MPA side. So it was very messy. Then we started to see others very quickly. Mark Marissen, a well-known politically active backroom guy who's run tons of campaigns that you and I both know, announced that he was going to run for mayor. We'd already heard about Ken Sim and his A Better City party was going to run. And then later on, there were more kind of strong rumors about Jody Wilson-Raybould still possibly entering the race. I'm getting tired even just sort of listening to them.
I think you forgot. Did you mention Kennedy Stewart? I don't know.
Well, and then even Andrea Reimer is still on from Vision Vancouver, is still being chatted about in that same breath. So what an amazing, almost chaotic landscape that we're going into this election year in 2022. Daniel, what are your sort of thinking about why this is happening, and why is Vancouver been so politically divided?
Well, there's a number of reasons, Mike. I think I could spend way more than your podcast kind of talking about it, but I just will highlight a few. I think part of it is, a lack of a strong leader, like someone who is a strong mayor, who has a very strong vision for the city of Vancouver that people can get behind. And with all due respect to Kennedy, is a nice person. I don't think he's not a bad person, but I don't think Kennedy would be on the same level as, say, someone like a Gordon Campbell, who had a vision for Metro Vancouver, who provided that regional leadership, had a very good, strong council that they were working for. Of course, a different era, different political parties, all that stuff. But the lack of a strong leader can have a huge impact. We're also just seeing the general, fracturing of all our political parties, and Vancouver is kind of the first out of the gate in all of this. But it really started when, for those of you who follow municipal politics going back a few decades, with the Philip Owen and Jennifer Clark split, and that kind of got the chemical equation going within the NPA, and it's never been the same since. It's had battles with its mayor and some council, but nothing to the extent of what we've just seen in April. I mean, having what you just rattled off in terms of, John Coupar's announcement, and then the split of all the councillors, nothing like that. It really has never been on that level. So it just speaks to a fracturing, and I think there's more, Mike. I think we don't know if Jody Wilson-Raybould is going to run. The mayor has indicated he's going to set up his own political party. What does that mean? Who is that? I think for the voters, it's going to be just a real mess. I think it's just going to be confusing to have 4 or 5 mayoral candidates on the ballot. All their competing parties, they're all going to be fighting for dollars to try to get donations. I can only imagine how chaotic and how crazy it's going to be in 2022 leading up. But I will also comment on the time frame as well. Like, to announce this in April of 2021, 18 months out from the municipal election, is unheard of. And I don't think we're ever going to go back now. I think this is going to become the new standard of, but for so many people who are running municipally, the thought of an 18-month municipal election campaign is just, it's going to scare a lot of people out. And we're going to end up losing a lot of really good people who would otherwise put their name on the ballots, because there's no way they're going to participate in an 18-month campaign.
I think you've put your finger on it. It is going to be a deterrent to good people from the community, which is what you're always looking for. People who actually have some connecting tissue to the community and have some experience in governance, whether it be working in business, whether working in nonprofits, whether they're working in community work. It would be really great to see a solid group of 10 people who have sort of a thoughtful approach to the important issues of the day, and a strong leader that brings the city together. The problem is that we've seen a lot of divide and conquer, to use that old phrase to describe how Vancouver has got people elected. A very low voter turnout, very low votes to get people into office. There's also an interesting factor that we haven't discussed yet, and why I think this is significant, is the changes that we've seen over the last few years in the election finance rules. Now you have to you have a requirement of only a certain amount of money you can raise per year. And you also have limits. You have no longer business donations. You have some rules around labor unions, although they are still trying to figure out, I think they're still indicating that they want to still use that kind of PAC approach to running campaigns. So I think that's another driver that is is kind of contorting and changing
Oh,
local
yeah.
government elections. And I don't think it's a positive thing. I must admit, I yearn for the old days when campaigns were shorter and more focused, but I think that horse is out of the barn.
Well, and I think that, without getting too deep into the weeds here with that piece of legislation, but it has a lot of upsides and it has a lot of downsides. Part of the upside is it's actually making more open and transparent, effectively political slates that were there before, but were just hidden from the public view. And I'll use New Westminster as an example. I did not know, for example, in New Westminster when I moved here, that there was a political slate. There were people who were all working behind the scenes, who were all sharing lists, who were all working together on an election campaign. I had no idea, so I was a bit kind of unaware of that from the municipal side, and that was probably happening in a lot of areas. This legislation brings that out from behind the back rooms and the smoke-filled rooms and out into the front, which I think is a good thing. I think what it'll do is it'll help voters better understand where people are and are not in terms of their kind of political alliances. Where it has downsides, as there are a lot of downsides. It's forcing people to become elector organizations, and it actually is. And as you said, they've got to set up a certain constitution, bylaws, have an executive, run 18-month campaigns, do all the stuff that requires a lot of energy. And like you said, there's likely going to be some people who just say, "This isn't. I'm not cut out. I'm not cut out for this." And then lastly, from a financial perspective, the rules in this new legislation places caps on how much you can raise, but unlike provincial or federal, it doesn't actually allow you to provide a tax credit. So you've got the identical system for federal and provincial in terms of the caps, but there's no incentive there to actually allow candidates to help fundraise, to actually get some dollars to the door, to maybe help even independent candidates or others who might want to throw their hat in the mix. So yeah, who knows, Mike, where in 10 years from now when we're talking, perhaps this legislation will look back and say it was the best thing since sliced bread. But I think early days anyways, especially what we're seeing in places like Vancouver and Surrey, it's concerning.
So I'm going to use this discussion and move us into the month of June, because a lot of the same issues are coming out. You talked about what was happening with electoral organizations in New Westminster. couple of stories that came out this year, but one that was very interesting is the election of a non-NUS district labor council, i.e. sort of a union or labor group endorsed candidate, getting elected in a by-election in Burnaby, and his name is Mike Hillman. You and I both know Mike for many years. He's a longtime federal Liberal, was involved in the establishment of Expo 86, so he's got a fair bit of tread burned off his tires after doing so much good work over the many years. But this is something that he felt passionate about. And so even though he is retired, he's decided that he wanted to run for council. He was elected. He was one of two councillors that were elected in Burnaby. Mike, as many people will know, had a close connection to the current mayor, Mike Hurley, who again sort of broke the mold a little bit because he came up and knocked off, he was the giant slayer. Derek Corrigan was for many years the choice of the District Labour Council, and was a very powerful figure in Metro Vancouver politics. So I want to tie together a little bit what's happening with the ruckus over Together New West, the attempt at trying to create an elector organization in New Westminster, but also talk about what it means for Mike Hillman to get elected in Burnaby.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Mike, but I'll start first by saying that, Mike's victory was actually a big surprise. I was surprised he pulled that off and he was able to win that. But then in some ways I wasn't, because, the District Labour Council, they endorse candidates throughout the Metro Vancouver area, and they're very good at being able to get their vote out and to get those folks elected. They're a little less their strength is a little less visible in by-elections. And you look in New Westminster, there was a by-election for the school board, and Mary Lalji won that. She was an independent, and she beat the District Labour Council candidate in a by-election. Not a lot of people voted, but she won. Mike did the same thing in Burnaby. Again, a non-District Labour Council candidate. You'd think that they'd be able to really win those seats. So what'll be interesting with Mike is to see how that translates into the general election in 2022. What his relationship will be with Mayor Hurley, whether or not there's some alliance there or not, I don't know. I don't follow the Burnaby insider kind of politics as closely perhaps as I should be. But what speaks to this is that, kudos to the NDP provincially, because they really have done a great job of working and kind of penetrating so many of the municipal sides here, and so many people who run for municipal council end up running provincially for the NDP. You've seen, in fact, you look at names like Selena Robinson and others who become ministers of finance. They start in the municipal side, they make their way up to the provincial side. I think the federal Liberals and the Conservatives and the BC Liberals and the non-NDP political parties, provincially and federally, are a little late to the game. Like, they're only maybe kind of suddenly realizing that, oh, maybe we should, involve ourselves at the municipal side. And they're way behind the eight ball, because their political opponent in the NDP are so far ahead of them, and they probably can't even see them. But electing someone like Mike Hillman could potentially be a catalyst to some of that change in Burnaby. We'll see. I don't know. The jury's out. General elections are very different than by-elections. They produce very different results. And it's a powerful slate that the District Labour Council has in Burnaby, and I can only imagine that whoever they check off as the folks they're going to support, they're going to have a large amount of votes turning out on October 15th.
So before we get into July, I want to just leave off again on that theme of sort of divided slates. The city of Surrey, which is BC's rapidly growing second largest municipality in BC, has had its fair share of bumps, and again around the policing issue. The creation of a new Surrey police force has been an issue that has divided a lot of political figures. We now have the one-time Surrey Safe Surrey coalition that has now been kind of reduced now with people leaving that coalition. We've got Brenda Locke, who both you and I have known for years, announcing that she's going to be running for mayor. Again, we're sort of seeing a lot of changes. It's a little bit of a different flavor in Surrey, and why it's why things have been. But Surrey, in some ways, is very unique in its own politics. Any sort of quick thoughts on where things are going again with election 2022 sort of staring at us in a few months?
Well, you and I were talking about the significance earlier about the significance of how when you look back over the decades, uh, either Surrey was in a mess or Vancouver was in a mess. But very rarely, I can't remember, anyways, when both cities were facing effectively political chaos at the same time. We are seeing right now two of our largest cities in Vancouver and Surrey being split right down the middle. In fact, Vancouver's fractured not down the middle, but in little chunks and little pieces, and Surrey is split right down the middle, kind of a 5-4 kind of split. And that's unique. We've never really seen that. So what that is going to, in my view, what's going to happen in 2022 is there is going to be a lot more media attention, notwithstanding the fact that there's a lot of attention on the pandemic, and that'll continue. But as we move to the municipal election, I think you're going to see, Mike, this evolution of interest in the municipal side, because for the first time, you have two largest cities that are up for grabs. Nobody's going to know who's going to be leading those cities come October 16th in the morning after they've counted. And I think that that's somewhat a good thing. But then when you look at the two cities, it's really nice to have one of them being stable so that there is, kind of a sense of stability there in one of our largest cities. And so that's a bit unique, and I've never seen that. And it's only seems to be getting, in brackets, kind of worse, because it seems to continuing to be fracturing. But I think Surrey is going to be an interesting race to watch. I think that I wouldn't discount Mayor McCallum. People are saying that he's not going to get reelected. I think people do that to their own detriment. I think he's speaking to his voter base. He knows who he's talking to. He's got a huge depth of connections there. But then I look at Brenda Locke, and I know that she's got a lot of support, and she's been working on this whole RCMP Surrey police issue. And I know that she's building her support. So I can tell you, I will definitely be watching that election to see where that all goes. But there's a lot more of the story to be told throughout 2022.
We won't be doing too much forecasting in this episode of the podcast, but 2022, as you are indicating, will drive a lot of changes. Some speculation whether Malcolm Brody, I think, has said that he's going to be running again. Although you never know with him. He's been again one of the longest serving mayors in Metro Vancouver. There's a funny story that I read about Stu Young, who was first elected as mayor in 1993. So he's going on to almost 30 years. He's still not indicating, but who knows? That's Langford, BC is a completely unique part of the province. So moving into July, it all really became about some of the natural disasters and how both the province and local government responded. Of course, we had the heat dome, which happened at the very end of June, and the implications of that heat dome were quickly discovered, with our paramedic service being kind of brought to its knees by calls. Sadly, hundreds of losses of life. We had wildfires, and then ultimately, tragically, the loss of the town of Lytton, which was getting close to almost 50 degrees Celsius before wildfires swept through and burned the town to the ground within less than an hour. I mean, it was absolutely appalling. So one of the sort of the big takeaways of this has been, what do we do? How can we better prepare for what is clearly a shift? This brought climate change right front and center in terms of the people's attention. We're going to talk a little bit more about the fall weather and some of the extreme weather that we saw there. But the heat dome was something that was unbelievable and unprecedented. What's your takeaway on what we saw happening last July?
Well, I think if you look back to July and you look at what happened in the heat dome, but it's bigger than the heat dome, Mike. I mean, to look back, it really is going back to just our climate and the climate change and the whole issue of climate change and making it real for people. And I think for many people, climate change was an academic debate up until July. And when 800 plus people, according to, I believe, the coroner's office, have been attributed to have died as a result of that heat dome. We're talking a lot of people. These are people's lives. These are not just like a number. This is 800 plus people who effectively died of heat in their apartments because they'd had lack of air conditioning, and many of them were seniors. And in fact, I believe New Westminster had the highest proportion or number of people die in that heat dome in my own community, in my own backyard. And I think it speaks to a bigger issue, Mike. And I know that the provincial legislation is being updated on emergency response and emergency planning, and it's getting a long overdue update and refurbishment. But I think it speaks to what is the role of the cities and what is the role of the provincial government and what is the role of the federal government. And I'm going to throw First Nations in there too, because oftentimes they get lost in the mix, but they are their own government as well. And so who should be playing what role? And I think very quickly, and I mean quickly being like literally within the next few months, we need to get a summit, or we need to get our elected officials together to begin this discussion, because I don't want the federal government managing an emergency response on my waterfront here in New West. I want the people who are closest to the ground managing it, but the people with the biggest pocketbooks and the people with the checks and the ability to have levers for legislation are not at the municipal, they're at the provincial and federal. So it really comes down to how do we define what the roles are. And when you look at Lytton and you look what happened in Lytton, and you know, just the ability to be able to do advanced notification using technology, being able to get people out safely, moving them in. I first of all want to applaud everyone who worked on that and helped house people, and I got to see some of that a little bit firsthand. It was a Herculean effort to give these people homes and keep them safe. But coming out of this, Mike, I think we should use these climate kind of catastrophes and not just look back at them and say, hey, we had a fire, we had a flood, we had this, right. But what are the roles of our municipal, and this is a municipal focused podcast, what is the role of our municipal governments when it comes to this? And I don't think we have all the answers to that, but I think we need to pull our political leadership together to discuss it.
We're going to talk a little bit more about this topic later on in the fall when we get into some of the floods and atmospheric rivers and extreme weather that we saw then. But I just want to acknowledge also the mayor of Lytton, and also the First Nations in the Fraser Canyon and around Lytton as well, that all rallied, and I think really their work was responsible for saving a lot of lives. Unfortunately, a couple of people did die during that wildfire that raged through Lytton. But again, it's those local people and that leadership on the ground that is absolutely critical. We'll pick up the conversation on BC's top local government stories of 2021 in the next episode of Vancouver Overcast with Mike Klassen. In addition, episode 17 will feature the first ever City Caucus Local Government Leaders of the Year recognition. It promises to bring you more riveting conversation and analysis from my friend Daniel. Thank you for listening, and be sure to like, share, and rate the podcast. Visit www.overcast.yvr to learn more about how you can support Vancouver Overcast and Mike Klassen. See you next time.